Hi everybody, welcome to PHP Mobile and RightScale, the right way to do mobile. My name is Kent Mitchell, I'm a Senior Director of Product Management here at Zend. A few things about PHP that people may not be aware of. PHP is actually incredibly popular. It runs about 40% of the web or more. Some people estimate as much as 50% of the web. Companies like Facebook, Amazon, a lot of companies you might have heard of before. We actually did a survey recently why people choose PHP, and one of the key things was speed of development, and another key thing was integration with the cloud. It was really interesting to understand that people are really looking at sort of the speed of development as being a key factor, and I think you'll see from this demonstration that I'm going to have later on how that development speed can really be obtained. One of the other things was we asked them to compare it to their next most common language, which was often Java or .NET, and it was interesting to see how this has shifted over the years, because it used to be that people were always concerned about security and other things with PHP, but I think that's sort of crossed into the mainstream now, and people pretty much assume that PHP is a viable language for doing things, especially in the cloud. What was interesting was the convergence of cloud and mobile. So when we talked to customers, basically 72% of the customers that we talked to said that they're using cloud-based services and APIs. So that was actually really interesting to see the convergence of PHP with the cloud. And we also saw that basically 2/3 of the developers are working on mobile projects. So right now, cloud and mobile is really hot, and cloud and mobile used together is actually a very viable combination. We'll talk about in a minute why. The other thing that was interesting was to see the shift. About 60% of the PHP applications that people are running are what would be called business critical. And that's things that either generate revenue for the company or are critical for their internal and external operations. And so that shift has changed pretty dramatically as PHP sort of entered the mainstream. And we have companies like BNP Paribas, a pretty big bank, Fox Media, Disney, a lot of pretty big companies are using PHP for things these days. So when people think about mobile apps, they typically think about the client. Everybody thinks about, oh, what's the mobile app? It's the thing that runs on the phone. But a mobile application, the overall application, is more than the client. So mobile applications, yes, they run on the clients, they run on your Android phone, they run on your iPhone, your iPad, but they almost always talk to back-end services today. Very few mobile apps are self-contained. Okay, maybe if you're playing Angry Birds, it's all on your mobile app. But any sort of business-related app is talking to back-end services. And those back-end services are typically things that can run in the cloud. They're sets of web services, RESTful services, or RPC-type services. They use technologies that, like web server-based technologies, and they're very amenable to being run in the cloud. A language like PHP that can run really well in the cloud because of its scalability also has great interfaces to things like Facebook and other sorts of things like Twitter and social media. Everything today, when people are talking about mobile apps, they're talking about how do I make my mobile apps more social, and so forth. But the reality of the situation is, in addition to that, you need to talk to existing back-end services. If I'm Wells Fargo and I want to produce a mobile app, I may want to have a social aspect of that where I can have people say, oh, tell their friends about something that's going on or whatever, but I still got to talk to those back-end systems, probably many of which are written, and may even run on mainframes. And so you need a system that will allow you to develop an application in the cloud, but then talk to a lot of back-end systems. And one of the things that PHP excels at is interfaces to other environments. There's just a lot of interfaces out there to a lot of different technologies. And so that's one of the things that it's really, really quite good at. So when you're building mobile apps, what are some things you need to think about? So one, you need to build mobile skills into your core development team. So you have to think about how you want to go about doing this. And Zend recommends using HTML and JavaScript as your primary mobile technology, and take a mobile-first approach. Think about your mobile app first. Because if you think about mobile first, it'll be really easy to build a web interface when you want a browser-based interface. If you don't think about mobile first, what ends up happening is people end up getting the business logic and the back-end services they need intertwined with their HTML. And if you think about mobile first, you have to think about, okay, I need pure HTML and JavaScript, and then I need web services. And you'll think about it that way, you'll end up with a much better architecture. So you have to think about this API-centric approach. You have to think about, how do I build web services? What do I want them to do? Worry about the personalization and the contextual experience on the server. Think about how you're going to create this experience that you want to create. And then let that server that you're going to run these services on do the aggregation from all your back-end systems. So you create your web service and maybe it reaches out to Twitter and pulls some Twitter information. Maybe it reaches out to a back-end system and pulls their previous order history. Whatever it is that you need to aggregate. The other thing that's really different about mobile development is you have to think about agile development. How many people in here have like an iPhone? Anybody? How many updates a week to iPhone apps do you think you get? I get about 10 a week. Apps on the iPhone, people expect apps, mobile apps, to be updated all the time. And if you're going to take a traditional, like let's build an app for 6 months and finally deliver it, people aren't happy with that. And so you've got to come up with a system that allows you to be agile, and you've got to come up with a system that allows you to scale as things happen. And that's where the tie-in to technologies like the cloud and to RightScale come into play, where if you can build a system where you can be agile in the front-end development, you can be developing web services and scaling those, you're going to be able to handle the sort of whole agile DevOps that you have to have. You can't have a very rigid, long process in this environment. It's just not going to work. So when you're thinking about your solution, again, agility and scalability. Dynamic languages like PHP, Ruby, allow development teams to code faster. They simply do. It's been pretty proven by a lot of people. That's not to say you can't build something in Java and have it work. You can. But dynamic languages are a little bit better for that. You need to think about automating your release processes. You need to look at technologies like Hudson, Jenkins, things like that, and see if you can automate this process so you can be more agile. And you got to think about the cloud. Maybe it's a private cloud if you're concerned about security or whatever and you want to run a private cloud. Set up an OpenStack cloud on your premise. Still hook it up to RightScale, do whatever. But you need to think about, how am I going to scale? Because one of the things about mobile apps is if you're successful and your app becomes social and you're not ready to scale, you have a problem. That's just sort of, I don't think I'm really telling anybody here that's a cloud person something they don't understand, but that's just the way that things are. The other thing is quality becomes more important. You have less control over how people react to your apps, and your quality needs to be higher. And so you need tools that are going to let people diagnose problems in production, figure out what's going on, quickly roll out a new release under your agile development model. And last but not least, you got to have something that integrates. Obviously, Zend, we're the PHP company. I'm going to propose PHP. One of the advantages I think PHP has over some of the other dynamic languages like Python and Ruby is its ability to interconnect with stuff. If you want an interface to something, it's probably been written for PHP. So what does Zend do in this space? We have basically 3 things. One is Zen Server. It's our PHP application server. It's built on top of a standard LAMP stack, and then we add a bunch of capabilities to it for monitoring and diagnosis. So if something goes wrong, you can deal with it. We are integrated with RightScale, so we can provide full scalability up and down and full fault-tolerant HA. So if one of the servers happens to fail, the system will automatically fail over to another server, sessions are maintained, and so forth. We have something called the Zen Server Gateway. The idea behind this gateway is to allow you to write web services without having to know everything that there is about web services. So it takes care of things like authentication, field validation, and a lot of the other sort of bookkeeping things that you need to do in a web service without having to know every excruciating detail about how that's going to be done, and I'll show how that works in a minute. It's based on top of Zen Framework. Zen Framework's an open source PHP framework. It's very widely available. It's been downloaded millions of times by developers, so it's very, very popular. And then we have Zen Studio. It's an IDE product. It allows you to do the construction of the web services and the mobile as a simple drag and drop interface. So I can literally drag and drop things and then start binding them together, binding my UI to my web service and so forth. And so I'll sort of go through and show you how all of this stuff works. When running in RightScale, this is pretty much what gets set up out of the box automatically. So if you go to RightScale and you run the Zen server pattern, this is pretty much what gets set up. It sets up a set of fault-tolerant redundant load balancers. It sets up a Zen server and then a scaling array to scale up and down automatically. And it sets up a database with a master-slave replication setup. And so out of the box, this is what's set up. So if you want a basic, elastic, scalable environment, you can go to RightScale, you can get the Zen server templates, and this is what they do out of the box. It's basically a codification of RightScale's best practices and Zen's best practices about how to set up a scalable PHP environment. So much for talking, because that's not nearly as interesting as actually seeing. So I'm going to go ahead and pop over to Zen Studio. And if I want to create a mobile application that's connected to the cloud, I simply say create a new cloud-connected mobile application. And essentially I have two parts. I'm going to call one part mobile, and I'm going to very creatively call the other part cloud. And then what I can do is I'm going to tell it where to run my cloud side of this application. So I could run it on my local server. I could run it in a number of different places. I'm actually going to connect up to something called phpcloud.com. This is Zen server running in the cloud for developers. It's absolutely free. So if you're a developer, you want to use Zen server, you want to develop something in the cloud as a free developer environment, this is for you. And I simply say finish. It's going to connect out to my PHP Cloud account. It's going to find all of my different running containers out there that I could possibly deploy this application into. And hopefully it will come back very shortly and give me a list of containers. And I'm going to pick the one labeled CCM demo. And I click next. And I'm going to have it give me some samples to start with. I click finish. And what it's going to do is it's going to create me a mobile application, and it's going to create me a cloud, a web services application that I can basically develop jointly. So first we have a little piece of mobile code, and then it's actually going to do a few other things. I'm going to shrink this down because we don't need it right now. So here's a little tool for basically building a mobile application. I've got little HTML5, jQuery mobile stuff over here. I can just drag and drop components onto the screen. And I've got an application that I can build. And then over here, I've got my cloud-based application. And it has my mechanism here to deploy it to various cloud things, and here's where I've got my web services that I can build and drag and drop. So I've basically got a place here where I can build web services with a drag and drop interface. I've got a place over here where I can build a mobile app. Before I do that, let me go ahead and deploy this application. So it's going to deploy it out to CCM demo. Ignore the work-light part of this. So actually taking this application that has these three web services and I'm deploying it out to PHP Cloud. So it's basically packaging that application up, sending it to Zen server, saying deploy this application. And then it's also going to set up Zen server so that I can debug those applications, so I can automatically have debugging of my web services. I can test my web services, etc. The network in here seems to be really speedy for some reason, because this should be done by now. There we go. So while that's running in the background, I'll come back over here. And so we'll talk a little bit about what's going on here. Okay, come on, guys. All right, we'll run this in the background. So what we've got here is, as I said, a little drag and drop interface, and we can literally take this thing and we can say, let's run it as a web mobile application. So I can actually run a web mobile application, and it'll actually run in a little emulator here. So I can actually build this entire application. I can run it in a little emulator here. I can test it. If I try to test it right now, it'll probably complain. Yeah, the network here is definitely not the speediest on the planet because it's trying to go out and actually fetch the stuff from the web. Wow. So at any rate, basically what it does, and I'll show you how this works. So while that's running, we'll see if we can come over here and demo this. What we've got here is a button. This button is bound to a web service. So I can simply bind a button to a web service by picking the web service from a list of web services that I have defined in my project. And so this one is bound to something called get customers. So if I come over here and I look at Gateway XML, I've got a get customers function right here. And so I can do things like say, let's test that service. And I can pop up something that will let me test web services from inside the GUI simply by coming up here and clicking run. And it should test that web service. And it can see that I actually called it. It tested the web service. It came back with the list of customers. And there they are. So now I have some chance that if I actually come back here and run this again, it may actually work. There we go. Now that my web service is deployed and the network's working. So what this app does is it brings up a list of people, and then I can click on them, and then it's bringing up this screen, and this is actually going out through an interface to Google Maps and getting the person's location and displaying the Google map here. And if I pick another person, again, it's going out and figuring out where this person is doing and what they're doing. This app is kind of interesting in that it's displaying where these people are, but it's not all that interesting because I can't actually add any new people or do anything interesting with it. And I want to show you how quickly you can do that kind of stuff. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to close this. I'm going to come here and I'm going to just say, okay, say I was developing an app. I needed a new page where I was going to add customers. So I'm going to create a new page called add. And then I'm going to put some components on that page. So I'm going to put a header on it. I'm going to call it add. Whoops. Call it add. I'm going to put a button on that page, like here. I'm going to call it back. I'm going to make it do a back arrow, like that. I'm going to just say that needs to go back to the main page. So I've already got some stuff going on here. I say, let's see, I need a text field. I'm going to call this one. That's not what I needed. Sorry, my bad. What I need is a text input field. I'm going to call this one name. And I'm going to need another text input field. I'm going to call this one location. And I know I can't spell, nor my spelling mistakes. I can't spell, I can't type. I can barely speak, but it's my best attribute, so I'm going to use that one. And then I can say I want a button. And this is the button that's going to actually add somebody. And I need it to call some function, some web service that's going to actually add a customer. But I don't have one of those yet. So how do I create one? Well, it's really simple. I just come back over here to this gateway thing. So leaving this for the moment, coming over here, I can grab this and I can simply drag and drop it over here. And I can say, what do I want to call this web service? So I'm just going to say, let's call it add. I'm going to say it's a post web service. So I'm going to send it information. And I need two parameters. So I got to add a parameter, add a body parameter. I'm going to call it name. Oops. Name. And I'm going to add a second parameter. I'm going to call it loc. Okay. And it says, it's basically can let me tie to an existing handler method, or I can say generate one. So if I just say OK, what it's going to do is it's going to generate all the plumbing for the web service. And then just basically gives me a method here where if you see what it's done is it's already pulled the name and location out of the request for me. And basically what I've got is a line, essentially, put your business logic here. You simply write your business logic right there, and you've got a web service. So whatever you need this business logic to do, you're ready to go, in essence. So I could do something here where I'm going to write the business logic. I'm going to actually not do that right now because I'm going to, just basically show you how this would work. I'm not that great at writing code on the fly. I usually make more typos when I write the code than I make when I'm doing anything else. But in essence, what you've got now is a web service here that's essentially all ready to go. And that web service is built. And if I just come back here to the gateway, if I wanted to test it, I could say test that web service. Now you see when it pops up the tester, it knows I have two parameters I need to fill in. So I can fill in those parameters. I could say foo, I could say bar, okay, I could say test. It's going to blow up. Why is it going to blow up? I never bothered to save this thing. So in essence, basically, you can quickly test these web services. It's actually failing for different reasons. It's failing because it's blowing up. I didn't return the right values, different things that are blowing up. But in essence, you've got things like this. If you test this service, it's the same thing. You can pass it in parameters, like so. You say test, and it's off, testing things and so forth. So you can basically build these things, quickly test them, deploy them. Now let's go back to our mobile GUI, and now we need to make it call that web service. So how do we make it call that web service? The answer is really simple. We click on the button again. We simply say, here's the web service I want to call, that add web service. As soon as I do that, it knows that it needs parameters. So it says, well, when we click on this button, I'm going to call this web service. Here's the parameters it wants. Where should they come from? And I say, okay, well, that one comes from text input field 1. This one comes from text input field 2. If the result needed to come back and go into another field, I can click and say the result from this needs to come back and go into another field. And so literally within a few seconds, I've created that binding, and now I've got a user interface that if I come in here and click this add button, it's actually going to call that web service. Okay? So within a few seconds, here we are setting up to call this web service from this mobile app. Now the only other thing we would need to do is we'd have to go back to the index page and have some way to get to this page. So we could come in here, say add a button down here, call it add. And we tell it needs to go to the add page. And so now I can just say run this. Sorry, yes, I do want to save the changes. And so now if I call add, it calls my method. If I call back, it's going to go back to the main screen. If I do this and fill in the values, it's going to basically bind those values and call the web service. Didn't have it do anything, so it didn't really do anything there. But in essence, you see how it will come back and display the information for me. So what I've got is a way to really quickly develop these web services by just simply dragging and dropping them, a way to really quickly develop the user interface, again with sort of drag and drop and quick bindings. And there's some additional things we can do. So over here on the web service, for example, where we had our add function, we can drag and drop in validation. So we can drag and drop validation on this and tell it how to validate these fields. So we can say, well, the name field needs to be validated as, parameters required, and we can drag and drop in validation. Why is that not working? My life is always good. Oh, add a validator. So I can say, should it have white space? It needs to be a date, which isn't good for a name, but it needs to be alpha, for example. People's names don't have numbers in them, so I can say add another validator. I can come to loc. I can say, let's add a validator for loc. Location needs to be also alphanumeric or barcode or whatever. These are all sort of predefined validators. Again, it's ultimately built on top of Zen Framework. So if you want additional validators, you can use any validator that Zen Framework has. You can write your own field validator. You can add it to the system. It's all ready to go. Same thing with authentication. You can come in here and you can drag and drop authentication onto this, and it'll basically tell you that it needs to authenticate this user, and it'll give you some different ways of authenticating the user automatically. And so you can build that into the system. So you've got a way here to quickly develop the web services you want, your mobile side. Now I've got this little HTML JavaScript that I was emulating. What if I want a real native application for this because I've got to deploy it to my iPhone? Well, we've integrated this into Adobe PhoneGap, which is a technology from Adobe. It's called Cordoba. The open source version of it is called Cordoba. And I can just simply say something like create an iPhone app like this. And I can say finish. And it's going to generate me another little project down here. And I can simply say run as an iOS application now. And it's going to actually go ahead and compile that application with the Codica stuff. It's going to actually then invoke in this case, the Apple Xcode environment, which is how you develop a native iPhone app. And it's going to launch that in the Xcode emulator for a iPhone. So it'll come up actually in there. And you can test things. And while you're testing things, you can actually debug it as well. So you can come in here. And as soon as this comes up, so there you see the little Xcode emulator coming up. And then if I go back to my targets here, I go back to here, we deploy a new version of this application. And then if I want to debug this, I can simply come to the target that I'm running on, CCM demo. And I can say start debug mode. And as soon as I turn on debug mode, what it's doing is it's telling the server to trap any requests that come in to this server. So if I say start debug mode, this network is really interesting. At times it's very speedy and at times it just seems to grind to a halt. But once you turn on debug mode, then even from this Xcode emulator, if I click the get list button, it should trigger a trap in the development environment. So you can be testing from this emulator. You could actually load it into your physical iPhone, put it in your physical iPhone, and still have it trap in the debugger. So when you're trying to figure out what's going on, you have the ability to do that. Now you can also tune that debug mode. You can say only trap these URLs or only trap this web service. So if you're trying to debug it in an environment where there's a lot of different web services running, you can fine tune it so you're not trapping everything that comes in. But this is still trying to upload the most current version of the app. We'll pretend like that was going to work. And so you might say, okay, well, I'm done with my debugging in the iPhone emulator. And again, if you didn't notice when I was here, I could also generate an Android application, a Windows mobile application. People have asked for BlackBerry. You can do that as well. We just haven't added it here. We can't decide if BlackBerry is really dead. I'm sure somebody in the audience probably still uses a BlackBerry and loves it. Sorry. On a number of levels, sorry. So once this is all done and once you've built all this, what you really want to do is take this application and put it into RightScale, for example. So I can come back to my deployment here, like so, and I can say deploy this application. And now what I want to do is deploy it into RightScale. So I can come here and just pick a different target. And it just so happens that I have a cluster running in RightScale already. It's at that very descriptive IP address because I'm running it in the Google Cloud and I didn't bother to set it up with a DNS name. But there you go. And I can say finish, and now it's going to bundle that application up and stick it out into this RightScale interface that's running in the Google Cloud. So let's go take a look. So there was my phpcloud.com site, which, by the way, if you look in here, whoops, you'll see the application deployed here. Here's my cloud application that's being deployed. It's having some problems. Okay, if I come over here to my RightScale deployment, okay, what you can see is that environment is set up. It's got a database server, a load balancer. It's got multiple Zen servers running in a scalable array down here. So here's all of the environment set up to show that off. Okay, here's my scalable array of servers. So all the things you're used to with RightScale, it's all set up here, scale up and scale down. Right now they're all voting to shrink because guess what? There's no activity on this site right now at this exact moment. So not surprisingly, they're voting to shrink. But if I come over to that application itself and log in, this is Zen Server. And Zen Server is a full, as I said, full PHP application server. And if I scroll down here, or I scroll, you see here's that cloud app I just deployed. So I just deployed that cloud app out here. Not too much activity has gone on that cloud app yet, obviously. But here it is deployed out into the environment. And I can do things from here, like I could look at, for example, the fact that it was deployed, and I can see in the audit trail that it was deployed right here. You can see that it logged in, so it deployed the app, everything went fine. And so within a few seconds, basically, I can turn around and deploy this app. Now, I was deploying it from the IDE to the production environment. That's not the most realistic scenario on the planet. Everything that Zen Server does is through a set of web service APIs. So that whole API first model that we said you should do, we built the entire UI for Zen Server that way. So within that environment, if you were using things like Hudson or Jenkins or some sort of automated system, or you wanted to deploy it, you can do it from the UI here as well. So from within the Zen Server UI, you can go to Applications, and you can say deploy another application and just pick up the package that might have been built by the IDE or it might have been built by an automated tool. And so you've got this full environment of capabilities here that lets you, build the mobile apps, deploy them into a scalable environment, and you've pretty much got the capabilities that I talked about that you need to support today's mobile applications. So at this point, I'm done with sort of the canned part of what I have to say. If anybody has any questions about either how we're set up inside RightScale or how this works, or Zen Server, or anything you saw, please speak up. Any questions? Nothing? One in the back, yes. Yeah, go ahead and I'll repeat the question.
So does your development environment allow, does it already have pre-canned ways of getting to like your address book or
yeah, so the question was getting information from the mobile native things like the camera, the contact list, and so forth. Yeah, actually, I didn't demo that, but one of the things that the Cordoba PhoneGap stuff brings to the table is the ability to access the native devices. So even while you're developing this little emulated thing, you can actually test things like getting things from the contact list and doing those kinds of things. So there are ways to do that. And just if you were going to download Zen Server and try it, when you create the project, there's a, let me just do something here just to get to the point where we can do it. Next. There's something here called Native API Example. That one will actually pull out an application that's actually using those native APIs to the phone. And then the thing about Cordoba / PhoneGap is the way that it does it is generic. So that if you're accessing the camera, you can do it in a generic way, and then it'll generate the right stuff for Android versus iPhone versus Windows Mobile. So it gives you that ability to do the things you need to do, access the services that you need to access without having to do it in a very platform-specific way. Any other questions? Stunned silence from
I can ask another one.
Sure, go ahead.
I didn't want to take it. The other thing we found as we're building mobile apps now is that there's a lot of things that customers need prepackaged that we haven't gotten around to yet, like a credit card interface, things like that. Does this have anything like that already built in, or because most applications there's some. Well, if you're going to do a payment or something, there's got to be some place you go that secured already, and someone could have credit card and that type of thing.
Right. I think that's one. So let me see if I translate your question back into my if my answer is going to answer your question. So what you're saying is, like, if somebody has to put a credit card into a mobile application, how do you actually validate that credit card and charge it appropriately? In essence, that's the idea behind this cloud-connected mobile. So if you connected that to a web service on your side, okay, and that web service is written in PHP, there are literally dozens of interfaces to payment gateways out there. And so it's pretty easy to, and in fact, I think there's even some Zen framework classes for that already built that will talk to various payment gateways. And from a compliance perspective, once you authorize the credit card, you don't need to keep the information anymore. You can throw it away, so you don't have to worry about PCI compliance, because it's really the job of the credit card company, the credit card authorization service. So it's really, really easy to call those services from PHP. So in essence, what you would do is you'd want to create a web service. You'd want that to be an HTTPS transport for the web service, so that the credit card number comes across encrypted. You would take that parameter that comes into the web service, you'd use an API to call probably another web service out in the world. It would do the credit card authorization, come back to you with whatever you need to track the payment. You'd be able to respond back to the user, hey, your credit card's been charged, your order should be shipped shortly. What's an interesting thing that you can do in Zen Server is, if in addition to authorizing that credit card, you then needed to create a shipment for the person, and then go talk to the UPS site and get a UPS tracking number, and blah 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 blah. You don't want to make the customer wait for that. So one of the features of Zen Server as a PHP environment is it allows you to use something called job queue, which can create asynchronous jobs. So you could authorize the credit card, which is where the critical piece is, send it back to the customer saying you'll get your shipping information shortly, and then spawn off an asynchronous job that would do all the shipping, talk to the UPS, get their tracking number, and then later on email them something back, or later on have it stored in a queue so that the next time they open the app, it would say, oh, your shipment's been sent. So you've got that capability to do some additional stuff on the server side as well to make that whole flow work better. No one else? Okay, thanks everybody. Hopefully this was useful to you. By the way, all of these products, Zen Server and Zen Studio, you can download for free. There's a free 30-day eval. Download them, check them out. Let us know what you think. As I said, if you want a development environment where you can play for free forever, check out phpcloud.com. And when you want to go production, we'd love to see you run it in RightScale. So thanks everybody.